Good evening, class. We're going to discuss Chapter 13 tonight, which deals with public finance and public choice. But before we jump into Chapter 13, let's go back and review just quickly what we went through in Chapter 12, where we talked about supply, demand of factor labor markets. And remember, in Chapter 12, we talked about the marginal revenue product of labor is defined as or equal to the marginal product of labor times the marginal revenue. And that the marginal factor cost is defined as the change in total cost divided by the change in the number of factor units. And again, factors, when we're talking about factors and, market factors, we're talking about labor, we're talking about capital stock, we're talking about natural resources, but more specifically, in most cases, land. And when you're looking at the factor markets, the rule of thumb is that you hire until the marginal revenue product of labor equals the marginal factor cost. And then we spent quite a bit of time talking about the labor supply. And labor supply is basically what drives the labor supply, drives it in and out, up and down, is the individuals, and we'll call them laborers for lack maybe of a better term, but since we're talking about the labor markets, laborers or individuals providing labor have decisions to make about how they want to spend their 24 hours in a day. Because we all know there's, you're not going to have more than 24 hours, in a day to spend. So you have individuals providing labor to the labor market are deciding between work and leisure. Those are your two basic categories. You can either punch the clock, or you can hang out on the couch watching, again, whatever people watch during the day on TV. And then we spent not so much time, and I think part of it was we talked about it in some earlier chapters. We talked about minimum wage, the impact of the minimum wage on the supply of labor. Minimum wage, again, it's a price floor. It's illegal to hire individuals and pay less than a minimum wage. And we also talked about not only the impact of minimum wage, but we talked about the impact of unions on the labor supply. And then we spent a little time talking about monopoly suppliers of labor and a monopsony. It's basically a buyer. So monopoly is a single seller of labor. Monopsony is a single buyer of labor. And spent a fair amount of time doing the comparisons between those two. And with that, that brings us up to speed. And again, tonight we're going to talk about public finance, public choice, the government's ability to, for the most part, jump in and intervene when, at least from a public policy perspective, where legislators, bureaucrats, public policy, economists, or just the economics of public policy, where they view that there have been failures in markets. It could be any market that they're going to dabble in, and we'll get into some, in a few minutes. But I want you to tell me, or see if you can figure out where this quote came from. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. Think it was Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Abraham Lincoln, maybe it's George Washington. If you guessed any of those, you're wrong. It's been credited to Ben Franklin. And that was one of his, at least supposedly famous sayings, is nothing is certain in this world but death and taxes. Taxes provide public service. Public finance, and they give you a definition of public finance, the study of government expenditure and tax policy and of their impact on the economy. So you've got the government out there dabbling in laws, regulations, developing, implementing public policy because they're trying to impact, for the most part, the economy. But there'll be some other things that we'll go through a little later that they are providing at least their version of a situation or a solution to market failures. And the government, typically is dabbling in either, they're trying to figure out how to manage the gross domestic product or GDP, and that's how, in the United States at least, and in a lot of countries, how the growth of the economy is actually measured, or at least it's a proxy for the growth of the economy. And they're typically trying to implement policies that are going to expand the economy, it's going to contract the economy, depending on what their very sophisticated economic models tell them. But they've got a bunch of, public policy, legislatures, legislators, bureaucrats in the back rooms of, or maybe in the bowels of the Capitol building, or with the House of Representatives or the Senate or somewhere. They've got a bunch of economists working away on their analytical models, and they're going to generate some information. Or there's some government agencies have some economists working away on it, or financial analysts, and they're going to generate some information. And then at that point, legislatures or legislators driving public policy are going to have the perfect answer as far as how to control the expansion or the contraction of the economy. And at that point, the authors in the text, they start to provide several definitions, impacting government revenues and expenditures. Government expenditures, it's the fairly simple definition: all spending by government agencies. So that's government expenditures. Government revenues, all funds received by government agencies. And as they talk about it in the text, it's going to be the lion's share that's going to be coming from taxes of one kind or another, and we'll go down through some of the different types of taxes later. But it's going to be pretty much driven by tax revenue. And you'll have, in the past, you've had presidents come in and they want to cut the tax rate for different sectors of the population, and then the next president will come in and they want to raise taxes, and then the next one. I mean, it's a cyclical mess as far as how they're determining and what's driving kind of the oscillation in taxes historically over time. Government purchases. Now, we talked about government expenditures, and I said it was all spending by government agencies. Now we're going to talk about government purchases, and that's goods and services purchased by a government agency. It's basically it's the opportunity cost of resources not purchased by the private sector. So you can purchase resources by the private sector, or the opportunity cost is going to be those purchases by the government sector. And I want to make sure you understand the difference between government expenditures and government purchases. Again, government expenditures is all spending by government agencies. Government purchases are goods and services purchased by a government agency. And we'll clarify that in a few minutes, but it is a very distinct definition and a very distinct differential between the two. And if you've had your macro econ class, you understand what I'm talking about. If you haven't had your macro econ class, may give you like a leg up when you get to this part of your especially the GDP piece of your macroeconomics class. Talk about transfer payments, and the definition is payments made by the government agencies to individuals in the form of grants rather than in return for labor or other services. It is a redistribution of income from one group to another. And typically in the United States, when you think of redistribution of income from one group to another, you think of income being redistributed from the rich to the poor, or the disadvantaged population, whatever terminology you want to use. And typically when you think of transfer payments, the one most people think about is Social Security. Probably it's one that at least if those of you in this class, your grandparents, I don't know what your parents are, but your grandparents may be on Social Security payments. If you know somebody, have a relative, or know somebody that worked for a federal government agency, it may be in the form of a pension. There's also financial assistance and for the underprivileged. So those are what we're calling transfer payments. And the widening gap between government expenditures and government purchases since the 1960s has been pretty significant. Economic assistance programs for lower income people, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. If you've ever had an economics class that talks about healthcare, then I teach one in the graduate program. But one of the first things we talk about is a journal article, I think published in 1963 by Kenneth Arrow, and he talks about the need for some of these assistance programs and the plight of healthcare for the elderly population and the less advantaged population. So Arrow was collecting data, and he was writing his journal article. It was published in 1963, and a lot of economists will point to that as being one of these, one of the driving journal articles, especially, but one of the driving factors for changing in the healthcare system. So Arrow publishes it in 1963, 1965. I think it was LBJ was president, and what happens? Enact Medicare, enact Medicaid. Comes along in 1966. They implement Champus, which is the health care program for the active duty military, their families, and retirees. Now it's known as TRICARE, but it started out as Champus. So there is an argument made for Arrow's journal article is to kind of jumpstart some of these transfer payments in the healthcare arena, especially to assist the elderly population and the underprivileged population, so that they could seek access, so they could gain access to quality healthcare goods and services. We also talk in the text about the balanced budget. Those of you in this class may be in an age category that, if you have been listening to the talking heads, in your lifetime, there hasn't been a balanced budget. I don't remember when the last balanced budget was, but it's been a while. And a balanced budget is a situation that occurs when a government's revenue equals its expenditures for a particular period. Make sense? Budget surplus is a situation that occurs when a government's revenue exceeds its expenditures. Wish we were in that situation. Budget deficit, situation that occurs when government expenditures exceed revenues. And most of, taxes drive revenues. Most of your lifetime, we've been in a budget deficit. I think budget deficits started in about 2001. They really started ramping up. So unless you're an individual born, probably before 2001, during your lifetime, the United States have been in a situation it's a budget deficit. And then the authors start talking about public regulation, services, environmental policies, and governments, actually do more over the last few years. And then they move, at that point, they start transitioning, and they get a little more detailed about federal government spending. And there's basically two broad categories of spending. There's discretionary spending, or expenditures, spending that must be approved by Congress each year. And that's what our fearless leaders in DC are trying to do now. they're trying to figure out how to get enough dollars to keep the government up and running. I'm not sure where exactly. I think they may have worked out a situation where they're going to keep it running to maybe after the first year, because you want to make sure the representatives, the senators, and they want to make sure they have a nice Christmas. They're obviously going to have a better Christmas than most of us, but still. And that's where you're talking about discretionary spending. So it has to be approved by Congress on a year-over-year basis. It's used for purchases of goods and services, wages and salaries of all the thousands of people that work in D.C. Either as government employees or some other mechanism in D.C. And it totals about 31%. Of the total budget. So you've got 31%, and then of that 31%, about 50% of that 31% goes for defense, which I never have a problem with defense because we definitely need it. There's another 47% goes to infrastructure, student loans, employee benefits, those types of things. Actually, and then you've got such 31, 47. You've got another 3 or 4% goes to foreign aid, and then the rest of it is kind of scattered around among some different agencies and different projects. And I think I've scribbled down on page 487. That's where they have the pie charts that talk about breakdowns in government spending. And then you've got what they call mandatory spending. Spending that is not subject to Congress and annual appropriations process. Again, Congress right now is trying to get appropriations bills up and passed, and mandatory spending doesn't depend on their ability or inability to get anything done. It is 61%. Most all is entitlement programs. Entitlement, it's federal programs that guarantees benefits or payments to any person who meets eligibility requirements. A third of mandatory spending goes to Social Security, the elderly population. Another third goes to Medicare and Medicaid. And again, Social Security are the Social Security checks that the elderly population get on a monthly basis. Again, transfer payments. Medicare and Medicaid, where it says about another third of that, it's healthcare services. And then you've got some what they call income security programs. You've got some interest rate payments built into that mandatory spending. Has usually a fairly small amount, but with interest rates that we're seeing now, it could be maybe a little bigger chunk of the expenditure pie this year. And when they talk about income and security programs, you're talking about mostly things like food stamps. Let's say, how many times have you been to the grocery and witnessed somebody with called an EBT card, and it's an electronic benefit transfer card. And the cards are provided to individuals, and on a monthly basis, sometime on the first, in the first part of the month, maybe the 5th working day or something, I don't remember the exact date, but money is transferred to that EBT card to buy groceries and other necessities. The big concern now is everybody coming up through the southern border, who's going to pay for that? And, does that end up falling under mandatory spending? And that's a question I don't think anybody's answered. If you go back to the discretionary spending, there's been a lot of, talk back and forth about, money that's just going to Ukraine to support the war. There's money talked about going to Israel to support that war. So because again, that's discretionary spending that has to be voted on by Congress to get it passed and through the system. So discretionary has to be voted on by Congress, has to be approved, usually on a yearly basis, but there can be some other votes that, again, like the war effort in Ukraine and Israel, that could fall under the discretionary spending. And then you've got mandatory spending that doesn't really have much to do with the annual appropriations or approval by Congress. Government is known for prudence, theft, and efficiency. Government attempts to manage market failures and to allocate resources efficiently. If you're not, remember, go back to profit maximizing firms. If you're producing marginal benefit equals marginal cost, you're going to not only maximize profits, but the net benefit to society is going to be maximized. And then go back, so that gets profit maximizing firms. We talk about perfect competition, and that's they're going to produce a marginal, in this case benefit, but marginal revenue equal marginal cost. And then you get to monopolies, and remember, monopolies, one of the concerns with the government and monopolies is that they are inefficient, because they are producing at a level where not only they actually produce at a level where marginal cost equals a marginal revenue to get the quantity piece, to get that quantity piece of it, and then they just go vertically up and hit that downward sloping demand curve and read over to the horizontal axis, and that gets their price. But in a monopolistic world, they're producing fewer goods, and they're charging a price that is higher than is set by marginal revenue equal marginal cost, because their price is greater than marginal cost. You'll get the same thing with anytime you've got an imperfect market or imperfect competition, you're going to end up with situations that are somewhat inefficient, and that's what government is looking at, and that's where they like to play in the sandbox with the private sector. Government agencies encourage or discourage consumption of certain goods and services. They encourage solar panels. They encourage EVs, or electric vehicles, depending on what you want to call them. And you think about how they discourage tobacco, alcohol, drugs. So the government is, again, government agencies are trying to play in the sandbox, because remember, the government knows more. The government knows how we should live our lives more so than we do. So just always remember that. If you want to know how to really live your life and how to live it to the fullest, just ask the government, because they'll be more than happy to tell you. Government redistributes incomes as either welfare payments or income redistributions, Social Security, a lot of ways that the government will redistribute income. And then government uses spending and tax policies to drive economic activity and price levels. Again, that's where we're talking about them trying to play in the sandbox when it comes to gross domestic product. And then again, governments, and there is a role for governments to kind of play in the private market sandbox, especially when it's market failures. As long as, and again, it sounds like I'm probably beating a dead horse, or you may think that the authors in the text were, unnecessarily repeating themselves over and over again. But as long as marginal benefit equals marginal cost, you're maximizing society's net benefits. Go back to our buddy Adam Smith and the invisible hand. He's always, his concept or his assumption was an invisible hand or market forces are going to drive markets to equilibrium prices and quantities. And those market forces over the, will, if left on their own, should drive us to a profit maximizing situation or a net benefit situation, in which where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. The efficient solution guides economy's scarce resources and factors of production to the most valued uses. Again, Adam Smith, was concerned about the factors of production and scarce resources and how they are driven to efficiency. Private markets are likely to produce less efficient quantities of public goods. And we've talked about public goods in one of the earlier chapters, but think about a private market trying to develop a national defense system, or having a standing army or standing military. It's just they are likely, because of the way they drive things to marginal benefit equal marginal cost, are likely to produce fewer quantities of a public good. And especially if it's a public good where you're going to have free riders involved, and the profit margins just aren't there for a private sector firm or in a private market. Private markets produce too much of goods that generate external costs and too little goods that generate external benefits. When we're talking about, let me think about an external cost. Air pollution. Have you ever been to Southern California and you're driving up either north on 5 or north on 15, and you kind of get to that Riverside, San Bernardino Valley, or you're over in LA, just the cloud of air pollution over that part of Southern California can be really debilitating at times. So, and that's what's considered an external cost. An external benefit, you usually I think in the text they talk about a baker baking bread, and the smell of the bread is an external benefit. It's something that as a consumer you're not paying for, but you're receiving a benefit from it. And then private markets fall short of optimality when markets are not perfectly competitive. And again, we talked about perfect competition. And then when we switch to imperfect markets, whether it's monopoly, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, at that point, that's where government gets concerned about the market power of some of those imperfect markets or imperfect competition. And the government's going to be concerned about how that imperfect competition, that imperfect market drives the efficiency that the government is seeking. They're trying to figure out, are those imperfect competition-based markets going to maximize society's net benefits? At this point, we're going to stop and come back in the second segment, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about, looks like we're going to be talking about public goods. Talk to everybody in a few minutes.